Hi everyone. We'll just wait for a minute or so that people are still joining, and then we started. I think we should get started now. So, hi and welcome everyone to today's session on sustainability and its key indicators relevant to the ICT sector. Thank you all for taking out time today for this very important topic and the important discussion. Our speaker for today is Mr. Reghu Kumar, Head Sustainability at BSI India. Reghu has over 3 decades of experience in the field of sustainability, academics, regulatory, consulting, auditing, and training. He was actively involved in the validation of several carbon projects for CDM, VCS, and GS across APAC region, including gas-based power project of Reliance Industries, a first of its kind e-waste recycling project of Atero Recycling, a power project of DLF, carbon footprint verification for JK Tires, Adani Powers, and more. Welcome, Reghu. He will be conversing with Mr. Anuj Duggal, who leads the ESG initiative at NASSCOM. Anuj brings 20 plus years of international expertise in dovetailing business strategies with execution roadmap to drive top and bottom line tech-enabled strategic initiatives at progressive and global organizations, which focus on sustainable business outcomes. His current focus is sustainability and ESG, especially ideating, creating and incorporating ESG frameworks in corporate management reporting. So over to you, Reghu. We look forward for a fruitful discussion today.
Thank you, Devanshu, and welcome everybody for this session. And let me share my screen first. Hope you are able to see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you. So welcome everybody once again, and this is a very, very important topic as far as the today's context is concerned. I think everybody is talking about sustainability, and that too, sustainability and carbon plus net zero. That's the buzzword that you can see all around. And especially now, the focus for this webinar will be on sustainability in the ICT sector and path towards net zero. So this is the topic for the day. And the agenda for the session will be like, I'm just covering that, what I'm going to cover: background and the global risk network, UN SDGs, COP26 commitments, trends in Indian corporates, carbon footprint, drivers specific to ICT and the standards related to that, and GHG inventory boundaries, sustainable value chain, carbon neutrality, and past 2060. I'll just touch upon that standard, and then circular economy, which is also very relevant to the sustainability aspects. Now, to start with, I think you must have seen this diagram from the World Economic Forum. In fact, World Economic Forum is actually publishing the results of the global risk perception surveys every year. And this is the report that has come out in 2021, wherein the respondents were asked to rank the most concerning risk to business globally and its drivers. And if you see 2021 report, it talks about the climate action failure as the top among the list, followed by infectious diseases and livelihood crisis and things like that following through. So this is in 2021. If you see the 2022 report, again, it corroborates the fact that climate action failure is actually contributing to the business risks, and it's a matter of concern for everybody. So it's very, very imperative that we need to tackle this aspect, and then there are a lot of actions that are going around this the climate action failure and means to tackle it. The Sustainable Development Goals, as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015, it provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people, planet, and for now and for future, right? So they identified the 17 goals, and these 17 Sustainable Development Goals calls for urgent action by all countries, developed and developing countries. Thereby, there is a global partnership with strategies that improve health, education, reduce inequality, spur economic growth while tackling the climate change and working to preserve our oceans and forests. So that's a very intent of having these 17 UNF SDGs. Following that, the United Nations Conference, the COP26 at Glasgow, reaffirmed the fact that the Paris Agreement goal of limiting the increase of average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade from the pre-industrial levels and pursuing its efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And the conference also expressed alarm and utmost concern that human activities give me a minute. So it's also raised concern and alarm over the human activities have caused around 1.1 degree centigrade warming of the temperature up to date. That impacts already or felt in various regions. In fact, we can see that the summers are getting extended. In fact, in Chennai, usually by this time we may be getting rains, but then it's extending beyond June 15th. It's a highly unusual phenomenon that is happening. So it also recognized that the impacts of climate change will be much more, and the temperature increases by beyond 1.5 degrees and when compared to the 2 degrees centigrade. So all these things actually are calling for very, very important aspect, like how we can curtail all these things and how we can do some actions to reduce the very cause of this whole problem, and which is eventually pointing towards the carbon emissions that we are doing, because of which the global warming and subsequent effects are being felt. So the concept of carbon neutrality as such is strengthened by the Paris Agreement, and though it entered into force in 2015 by 195 countries, the Paris Agreement set out a target to limit the global warming global warming to well below 2 degrees, right? So in fact, what happens is, like, this Paris Agreement itself is the bridge between today's policies and climate neutrality before the end of the century. Because now, based upon this agreement, many of the countries have committed itself to becoming net zero over the years. Some of the countries have committed to 2030, some of the countries have committed to 2050. But then also, we as India as a country, we are also committed to become carbon neutral by 2070. The India's commitment is also akin to not just to walk the talk, but the running the talk. In fact, our Prime Minister has also very clearly indicated that we are going to be doing actions on towards this. And the first point is India will get its non-fossil energy capacity by 500 gigawatts by 2030. And second one is India will meet 50% of its energy requirements from renewables by 2030. And India will reduce the total projected carbon emissions by 1 billion tons from now onwards till 2030. And by 2030, India will reduce the carbon intensity by its economy by less than 45%. So thereby, by 2070, we may become net zero. So that's a path that we are going to take, and there are actions very much on this as well. Futurescape has come up with a responsible business ranking in 2021 for 2021, wherein if you see Godrej Consumer Products tops the list, but then followed by Infosys and Wipro, which again, so the information technology is on the top performing industry, while the others are actually behind. And if you see all these 10 top companies which are on the list, what's happening is like all these 10 companies have mapped their business goals to sustainable development goals. So that's very, very important to see. To be very frank, this sustainability strategy as such is now driven by the stakeholder pressure. And for various organizations, this sustainable strategy is now driven by the stakeholder pressures. Customer requirements and financials are demanding that they need to have a proper sustainable strategy. And peer competition from the business part, other competitors, and operational efficiency, social license to operate, and reputation and brand image, because nowadays it's all connected to brand image and reputation. We have seen many of the companies, many of the multinational companies have really failed to progress because they didn't have a proper sustainable strategy. I don't want to name anyone, but there are very good examples that we have seen in the recent past as well. If you see the key trend in Indian corporates, it is like this. There's an increasing focus in setting emission reductions and renewable energy targets. And that is, the regulations are continue. They continue to be perceived as a risk rather than an opportunity. Companies are increasingly looking to set internal price for carbon. In fact, there are many software companies who have set internal pricing for the carbon itself. So that's one thing that we can see, and increasing awareness on data quality and assurance. So this is the way it is actually going. That means the data accuracy is very much important for everything. So if you see the top companies who are committed to net zero, it includes the TCS, Reliance, Mahindra & Mahindra, Wipro, Infosys, Adani Cement, the Almia Cement, ITC. So, there's a huge list. But then if you see that many of the software companies of the ITC sector, they are also coming into this bandwagon, and they are also committing to net zero targets. Maybe because they are actually doing it on their own, or there is some pressure from their customers to come up and then see that, you committed towards the net zero target. So now if you see this global data traffic from cellular to consumer fixed broadband networks between the years 2017 to 24, this is actually the graph I've taken from Informatech, which very clearly says that over the years, right? By 2024, there is a compounded growth of 29% with respect to the data traffic, and by 2024, it is expected that it will reach 5.8 million petabytes. So that's the amount of traffic that is actually increasing, and this calls for more of probably data centers, or nowadays people are moving towards cloud-based systems. So there's definitely a demand for energy. That's what I'm trying to say. If the data traffic increases, then obviously there's going to be the much more infrastructure that is required, and of course it's going to be consuming a lot of energy as well. Drivers specific to the ICT sector are, if you see the digital market expansion, if you see everything is going on digital, so that actually drives towards the ICT sector's energy needs and demands. And if you see, AT&T aims to be carbon neutral by 2035. BT reaffirmed its commitment to become net zero by 2045. Like that, many of the companies are coming forward to commit itself to net zero or to reduce their carbon emissions for a certain percentage by 2030 or 2040 or 2050. That's a huge list. So in turn, how they will do it? They may not do it on their own, in their own organization alone, but then the supply chain also becomes a part of the whole journey. So they in turn pass it on to the supply chain or the value chain, wherein some of the software companies here will be serving the organizations outside the country, maybe in US or UK or anywhere across the world. So by that way, they are passing on their journey towards net zero or journey towards driving reduction of carbon emissions to their supply chain. And you are also required to report on the quantum of carbon that is going to be reduced by your organization as scope 3 emissions from your side. It's very nice to see that Indian Railways, now they have also planned to become the world's first net zero carbon emitter railway network of the world. So they also committed by 2030, they wanted to be net zero. There are very serious actions that are going on from that perspective as well. So very many organizations are now committing itself to net zero or reducing their carbon emissions. Now, if you see the indicators to sustainability for ICT sector from the perspective of Global Reporting Initiative, GRI is an organization which is actually doing a lot of work in terms of sustainability and how to report sustainability aspects. They categorize broadly into 3 categories: people, planet, and profit. And under people, they say the indicators could be the labor in terms of health and safety and education and development, career opportunities, and human rights in terms of as per the ILO requirements, child labor, freedom for association, freedom for religion, etc. And in terms of society, the community development, corruption, competition, and in terms of product, the product safety, marketing, privacy, etc. I mean, for ICT sector, it becomes much more relevant on the information privacy. If you see the planet side, it is again the materials used, the losses, material losses or the waste, and how we can minimize the waste, and the energy consumption as direct consumption as well as indirect consumption, and water consumption and how much is getting recycled, the transport related emissions, and emissions of greenhouse gases, maybe from the processes or from other down the line, upstream and downstream of the processes as well. Because now we are considering a life cycle perspective from cradle to grave approach is the approach that is taken. So on the upstream side as well as the downstream side, it is very, very important for you to account for your emissions. That is what is propagated in the ISO 14064 also, which I will touch upon later. If you see the profit side, it is again the indicators of financial market positions and as well as other economic factors. Now, coming to the carbon footprint. So because now we talked about what is the background of all these things, and now we are talking about what is carbon footprint. Anyone can give the definition of what is carbon footprint? You can unmute and speak if you can. Can you, or you in the chat box, you can give your replies. What is your answer? What is carbon footprint? Anyone? Your understanding of what is carbon footprint is okay. Anybody on the chat box? Because I just want it to be much more interactive, because I don't want to be only talking from my side. If you can at least respond to maybe the 1 or 2 questions that I may ask, it will be good.
I think Reghu, Anuj here, I think we have some responses. I think greenhouse emission, Preeti Bora says. Then Sanjay Kumar says our footprint which generates CO2.
Okay.
I think those are good answers.
Okay.
The amount of carbon that gets released through my actions. Okay, that's a very, very direct answer. That's good.
Exactly. Yeah, correct. So, you know what is carbon footprint. So, by definition, it's absolute sum of all emissions of greenhouse gases, be it is not only limited to carbon dioxide, maybe other greenhouse gases as well, which may be directly or indirectly by any subject, right, or an entity, either over a defined period. Because always when we talk about carbon footprint, we will always represent it with respect to a prehistoric period or maybe a defined period. Or in relation to a specified unit of product. Suppose if you're talking with respect to a product, in that case, the carbon footprint for the product can also be accounted. Or instance of service, it is not related to only a product. It can be instance of service as well. For your service for that period from Jan 21 to say December 21, what is the amount of carbon that you released from various activities that you must have done across the period. So that amounts to the carbon footprint. It's actually the absolute sum of all the greenhouse gases, right? So now it can be the carbon footprint of any entity is a measure of the greenhouse gases emitted due to the activities of that entity. So now whether that entity can be only organizations, no, it can be anybody. No, I can calculate my carbon footprint for the period, maybe for 1 year period or for whatever period that I define. I can define what is my carbon footprint. It can be for individuals, it can be for families, it can be for clubs or social groups, communities. Nowadays, we also do carbon footprint for events, right? Sustainable events. So we can do the carbon footprint for events as well. Some event management companies are now coming forward to calculate their carbon footprint for their particular events. So it is not limited to only organizations. The point is it's not limited to only organizations, but it can be for any entity, right? And it's expressed in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent, because though there may be a number of gases which we may be contributing because of my various activities or your various activities, but then it need to be on a one scale. For that matter, it is expressed in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent in terms of carbon. The reference is CO2. So the carbon footprint gives a measure of the individuals or the entity's contribution towards global warming. So now how much amount of tons of CO2 that I am releasing into the atmosphere, that is the measure. Actually, that gives me a measure of how much I am contributing towards global warming. So unless I measure, I may not be knowing what is my contribution. So I may not be interested in doing anything from my side to control it or to curtail it. So that's why it's important that you need to measure your contribution or the organization's contribution towards this global warming. So thereby this carbon footprint measure is very, very important. So it's actually giving room for you to report for compliance, reduce risks of energy security, stay ahead for regulation, because nowadays it's going to be definitely the regulations are going to be tightened up, going by the commitments that our government is making or the various countries' commitments towards the various accords or maybe the international protocols that we are signing off. So in that case, all these things, ultimately culminate into some regulations which will be passed on to the organizations and probably industries as well. So in that case, when you're doing this carbon footprint and then you're having a measure of what you're doing, then you're definitely going to be staying ahead of the regulation. Identify hotspots, because once I measure my carbon footprint, then I'll be able to identify where I need to act upon, where I can reduce. So that will be giving an indication for me to really go in for the points where I can do actions, thereby reducing the carbon as well as the cost savings. Definitely it improves reputation as well. It's not that you're doing it only for a money pot, but then it increases your reputation and your public image, and it may meet the stakeholders and the client's demands. Nowadays, even the public are very much aware of what's happening around the climate change. Everybody talks about climate change. So when they come back and then ask you what is your contribution towards, sustainable development or sustainable strategies, then you'll be able to definitely quantify and tell in terms of this is the percentage that I'm reducing. This is the percentage that I'll be reducing over a period of time. Like that, there's a defined, quantified way of demonstrating that you are committed to the whole aspect. And you'll be able to monitor regularly to track your own performance. That's very important. So unless I track my performance, I'll be still. So it's very, very important that you demonstrate continual improvement. It's not that anybody is asking you to jump from 0 to 100, but then an improvement path where I am going to continuously improve on my sustainable journey. It's not going to be on a one day, right? It's a journey that we have to take from where we are to where we want to be. So that is why it is important for you to measure the carbon footprint and accordingly align your strategy so that you'll ultimately end up in where you want to be. Communicate to the outside world on your achievements. You can proudly say that this is the achievement I have achieved over the period, maybe 1 year period or a 2 year period or a 5 year period. Now, when it comes to the standards, there are two popular standards for GHG accounting. One is the GHG protocol, which is actually developed by the World Research Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, wherein it is initially come up in 2004, and subsequently there were revisions and there upgradations done, and with the scope 3 guidance lately it came up in 2011. But then in 14,064, initially it was it came out as a standard in 2006, but then in 2018 it went in for a revision, and the revision is actually having a lot of impact on the value chain. If you see between the 2006 and 2018 version of the standard, the 2006, the initial the standard was not talking much about the scope 3 emissions and accounting for the scope 3 emissions, but then the latest version is now emphasizing on the need for accounting the scope 3 emissions as well, and now the scope 1 scope 2 emissions are re-nomenclatured into category 1 to 6. We'll just go through that in the later slides. So you may ask why a risk standard is required. We can quantify it based upon whatever the emission factors and then the activity data. Then why there's a standard requirement. So it is now all these things are driven by international protocols and international commitments, and the business is now become international. It's not that limited to only one country. Now we are working with so many countries and so many different regions. So in such case, it is very, very important that you have a common stand or common way of addressing things, and there is a common language that we may use in the whole aspect. In that case, a standard is very much important. Clearly defining the boundary, defining the direct, indirect, and energy indirect and indirect emissions, defining the approach for calculations, guidelines to choose calculation methods, helping designing information management systems, defining report content, because when we are reporting it may go globally. In such case, how you're reporting and what you're reporting is very, very essential for the various stakeholders who may be going into the report. So in that case, there should be a defined structure for the report, which is why the standard is important. So the standard gives you a very clear picture of how it is to be done, how it should be represented, and how it should be reported. In such case, it will be much more global than limited to a particular group. And it also guides to the verification process as well. There are some, very clear methodologies that is given for how to do the verification and how the process has to be done. So this will give you more credibility when you are going to represent it to any forum. So the ISO 14060 family of standards is actually the part 1, part 2, and part 3. The part 1 talks about the organization level carbon footprinting, GHG accounting, and part 2 is project level GHG accounting, and part 3 is actually the guidelines for verifiers. So we need not go into those details, but then when you're actually going through a standard and that to an international standard, it enhances the environmental integrity of the GHG quantification and enhances credibility, consistency, and transparency of the GHG quantification, monitoring, reporting, as well as the process with which we have verified and validated, because all these things are defined by the standard itself, ISO standard itself. And it facilitates development and implementation of GHG management and strategies and plans, and facilitates development and implementation mitigation actions through emissions, emission reductions and removals, etc. Right? So very importantly, this 14060 families is very particularly talking about the GHG management, GHG accounting, and it gives a framework for you to go through how you need to account, how you need to monitor, measure, report, and everything will be concise there. If you see the principles of GHG accounting, it actually follows this 5 principles: relevance, because the data that you are projecting or maybe counting, it should be relevant to that particular scenario, and then it should be complete. It's not that you you do a part of it and then leave the next the other part of it, but the quantification need to be complete. Unless otherwise, it's a complete the quantification. It may not be representative of your GHG emissions that you're doing. Consistency with respect to the various data and data points that you're using, or the emission factors that you're using, whether it is consistent with the published literature. All these things are very, very important. Accuracy of the data, because accuracy of the data is also important, because unless otherwise the accuracy is maintained, you will end up with a wrong figure and you may be projecting a wrong GHG quantification value. And transparency. Wherever there are some limitations in quantification. It's not that the journey is very easy. Like, I mean, everywhere you have the complete data, there will be some areas where there can be some assumptions that you may be doing in the quantification, and it may be maybe referring through some literature. You may take some values through the literature. In such case, all those things need to be very transparently declared in the report, so that any third party who is reading the report or your GHG report will be very clear in understanding how you have done the whole, gone ahead with all the calculations, and whether these numbers, whatever you're projecting, are correct or not. So that much of transparency is expected in case of GHG accounting. In fact, you're supposed to be giving the Excel sheet with all the cells open and without any hiding any cells, and references given to all the numbers that you may pick up from the various literatures as well. So now, I was talking about this, operational boundaries and reporting boundaries as defined by the 40064 standard. Earlier, we used to call it, as per the GHG protocol as well, we used to call it as scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And even now, many of us are familiar with the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. But then in 14064, it is now re-nomenclatured as direct emissions, which are nothing but the previous scope 1 emissions, which are emissions from the operations that are owned and controlled by the reporting company. And second, this scope 2 is now re-nomenclatured as indirect emissions from energy. It can be use of purchased electricity, heating, cooling, etc. And the scope 3 emissions are further divided into indirect emissions for transportation. So the value chain emissions, all these things are now coming into 3 or 4, 4 different categories. So whichever you are unable to fit into any of the categories defined, the last category, which is the category 6, is actually given, which is the indirect emissions from others. So that's how it is. So why it is important now here is, over the period, we have realized that in some of the sectors, the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions alone may not be a true representation of the actual GHG emissions from that organization. Why? Because the scope 3 emissions are becoming much more than the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions which they may be actually accounting. Earlier, we had the opportunity, like, there are no emission factors available for certain activities. There are no emission factors which are publicly available specific to the country, and all these things were the limitations that we had earlier. But now, over a period of time, a lot of research has happened in this area. Thereby, if you see, you have emission factors for almost everything. Even for waste disposal, if you are going to dispose it to, landfill, if it is going for composting, if it is going for burning. So for each and every end disposal also, emission factors are now very clearly available. Thereby, you can do the accounting properly. So that's why now people started quantifying and then calculating the GHG emissions with respect to the other indirect emissions, and saw that it's actually becoming equal or something, sometimes even more than the scope 1, scope 2 emissions which they used to report. So that's why the standard is also now open, that the organization going in for reporting as per the 14,064 standard need to report with respect to all the categories, and wherever you see that you're not able to report, or maybe there are some limitations, then you may have to really explain and justify. That's exactly the term that is used in the standard. Explain and justify why you're not done that. So thereby, the value chain is becoming important, because now the upstream side emissions as well as the downstream side emissions are to be accounted. And if you see the some study conducted by IIM Udaipur, they come up with the finding that 23% of the companies studied give specific charges to their suppliers to reduce their carbon footprint. Nowadays, many of the companies are passing on this to their suppliers as well, because the scope 3 emissions are now getting accounted. It's an indication that now the scope 3 emissions are going even to the suppliers, and the value chain is now getting into the whole concept. Now, how to what is the difficulty? Because what is happening is this: the value chains are not prepared enough to capture the data, to report the data as is required by their customers, and thereby the data inaccuracies are there. So, initiation of supply chain sustainability program at suppliers end, communication of expectations from suppliers, initial assessment of supplier on the sustainability front, because they should be assessed, and what is their level of understanding, or what they are doing, and what is their level at which the data are getting captured. All these things are very important for you, because ultimately when they report to you, you're actually giving it as your emissions from your side, right? So in that case, it's very, very important that the supply chain also need to be educated and brought to light on the various dimensions of sustainability, and then they need to also be trained so that you will get a proper data for you to report. Now, there is always a debate between what is carbon neutral and what is net zero. People used to interchangeably use this, and without knowing actually what is carbon neutral and what is net zero. I just want to clarify this here. Carbon neutral is a condition in which during a specified period, again, we are talking about a specified period only, there has been a net increase. There has been no net increase in the global emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere as a result of greenhouse gas emissions from within the subject for the same period, right? So it's becoming carbon neutral. Whereas in case of net zero emissions for a company is actually involving achieving a state at which the value chain results in no net accumulation of CO2 into the atmosphere and no net impact on the greenhouse gas emissions. If you see, I can give it by an example here. So when it comes to carbon neutrality, the minimum requirement is you need to cover the scope 1, scope 2 emissions only. But whereas if you want to go to net zero, that means you're not going to leave out any of your emissions, but you need to cover scope 1, 2, and 3. It's required, right? Whereas in case of carbon neutral, there is no requirement for a company to reduce its emissions on a certain trajectory, right? You can always offset it through some purchasing of carbon offsets, but then carbon credits to offset that. But then in case of net zero, you need to actually be demonstrating that you're reducing your emissions on a 1.5 degree trajectory across scopes 1, 2, and 3. That's very, very important. So that's a level of understanding that we need to have between demonstrating carbon neutrality and becoming net zero. So in case of carbon neutral, an organization need to purchase carbon offsets that either result from carbon reductions or efficiencies or sinks. Whereas in case of net zero, you cannot do it like that. You cannot pay to pollute. No, so that's the concept. So you need to necessarily do actions to reduce your emissions, and then that need to be demonstrated on a 1.5 degrees centigrade reduction trajectory. So that's a very important point. Then how you will achieve carbon neutrality? So of course, the PAS 2060 standard is a standard. PAS means publicly available standard. So it's 2060 is a standard for demonstrating carbon neutrality, wherein there is a very clear requirement that for the first period, for the first application period alone, any organization who want to demonstrate carbon neutrality can buy credits and offset it. But for the subsequent periods, subsequent application period, it is necessary that they also need to demonstrate that they have done some actions to reduce their carbon emissions in addition to buying the carbon credits. That means you cannot just only buy the credits and then offset it, but then necessarily there need to be some actions from your side also for reducing your existing carbon emissions. That's a requirement from 2020. Unless otherwise you demonstrate that, you may not be able to demonstrate neutrality as per 2060, past 2060. In a way, it is driving the organizations towards doing actions for reducing emissions at their end. Now, when it comes to specifically ICT sector, the areas to focus for reducing carbon emissions are, I think you know that there are a lot of network transformations that are going on. Now people are moving towards cloud, because if you see data centers are consuming much larger energy. If you see compared to a normal ODC, it is 10 to 15 times the energy that is actually consumed in case of data centers. So in such case, it is obvious that you need to be focusing on this area where the energy consumption is more. And second is the cooling, the chillers. Now there is a huge shift between, moving from, people are moving from, air-cooled condensers, air-cooled chillers to water-cooled chillers, right? Because the air-cooled chillers, it was around the energy efficiency will be around 1.5 kilowatt per ton, whereas in case of water-cooled chiller, it will be 0.85 kilowatt per ton. So that means it's almost half. So people have initially gone in for air-cooled chillers, but then people are now coming back to water-cooled chillers, thereby reducing the energy consumption. And another important area is sleep or standby mode for networks and using artificial intelligence, replacing AC with up to 400 volt DC, and network sharing and renewable energy generation. Nowadays, people are also thinking of putting rooftop solars, thereby substituting their grid energy consumption. So these are the various areas that we can focus, and we can come up with the reduction of carbon emissions. So needless to say, when it comes to reduction of energy, we need to also talk about circular economy, which is nothing but it's an economic system aimed at eliminating waste and the continual use of resources, right? So because there's an intuitive link between climate change, carbon emissions, and circular economy, and it's relatively straightforward. We cannot differentiate that, and we cannot, do away with that. So basically, it starts with the design, and then how you see that at every stage of the process, you don't end up in making resource of waste, and it is how it is getting recycled within the process, so that you end up with the minimum of your waste generation, and you end up in a zero waste, and it's in a circular economy as well. There are specific standards around that. I'm not going to detail of that. British standard 8001 is one of the standards which will support the framework for circular economy, which is something like this. It starts with the framing. Scope framing means like, you frame the whole concept, and then scoping, you do it for a particular area, and then you do the idea generation with respect to the subject, involved with the subject matter experts. You create the idea generation and find out whether it's feasible or not, the feasibility study, and then make a business case, and then piloting and prototyping before you actually go into the full-fledged delivery and implementation. So this is the framework actually for the circular economy, which is actually defined by the British standards 8001. Now, there are so many standards which are aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals. If you see with respect to the SDG 7 and 12, ISO 50001 talks about energy management, past 2060 talks about carbon neutrality, ISO 14001 on energy management systems, 1474 on life cycle assessment, and 1490 on adaptation of climate change. And similarly for responsible consumption production, 14,074, sustainable procurement, which is again a picking up area where it's again like, thereby reducing your upstream side emissions, right? When you are procuring, which are procuring things or materials which are sustainable, that means you are actually reducing that much of emissions into your chain. So that's why this is also a picking up area. It's not a certifiable standard, but it's actually a guidance document to see how best you can do a framework to see that your procurements are going to be sustainable. And 46,001 water efficiency, and 1464, which is water footprint, and ISO 1467 carbon footprint verification. So there are many standards which are now coming up and which are aligned to this Sustainable Development Goals. I think more than 2,500 standards, I believe, are there, which will support in one way or the other the various 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Now, as I think coming to the end of this presentation, but then I will stop with this slide. As BSI, we are there to support you in all these carbon management, carbon neutrality, water management, environmental management. So all these areas we are there in case of training, certification, or verification or assessments. We are there to support you in every aspect of sustainability. So if you have any questions, then I will be ready to take it up.
Thank you, Reghu.
Yeah.
I'm Anuj Duggal here. I head ESG and sustainability for NASSCOM, and we are looking at how to drive it at scale for our members. But Reghu, that was a very, very informative session, I would say. I think there was so much information. I just try to see, and I think just because I have more background on it compared to maybe the audience, I'll just quickly summarize at least my learning. We looked at the background, of course, why sustainability and why ESG is critical and important. So the UN SDGs of Sustainable Development Goals, the Conference of Parties, of course, the Paris Agreement. I think what is key is, it is, and I think that's the net takeaway for everyone, that it's not a flavor of a year or flavor of the decade now. It's a reality which is hitting, has been hitting our generation and will hit the next generation more, I think. So it's the reality that, it's just one planet we have, irrespective of the country in which you live, the organization which you work in, the city in which you, in that country, you live in, ultimately you all are collectively, we all rather, not you all, we all are collectively participating in that one ecosystem. And we have to make sure that on the triple bottom line, I think that's the key here, the three P's, what we call the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profit. So companies are now increasingly focusing on a triple bottom line. The profit part, of course, is also important because the company exists for a profit and for a reason, for a purpose, but also to have economic sense. But what is increasingly becoming important is the impact you have through your products, through your services. And that's why that whole narrative of, scope one, scope two, direct, indirect becomes very, very key and critical. And then we come to all the latter part of what the standards, and a lot of people might say it's very boring, but I think that's the key, because you need to understand there is a method, there's a governance, there are frameworks, there are standards, you have GRI, you have SASB, you have other frameworks, also CDP, TCFD. I'll not go into all of them. And India itself, the SEBI is very, very progressive there. They've said that the Indian top 1,000 companies by market capitalization in India should have BRSR, which is the business reporting and responsibility and sustainability reporting. So last year it was voluntary for the top 1,000 companies. And from this financial year, 2022-23, which will end in March next year, they will have to report it as a mandatory filing, those top 1,000 by market capitalization. And I'm very sure that over time, it will just become for everyone. Yes. And same is holding true for legislation in the EU. The US SEC is doing the same. They are having some disclosures, which are very, at an impact level, what are your risks and opportunities for your environment? That's part of your framework risk management. But I think over time, it becomes part of your SEC filings also. So I think the key question, Reghu, I think I'll start off the question. There's some we already have. The key question is really, people, when they look at it at an individual level, or even a person in an organization, senior leadership, medium or small, medium, SMSC, MSME, let's say, when they look at this and they get a little bit overwhelmed, what should I do? Where should I start? So maybe you can give some sense of materiality, why is materiality important and why they should focus on where they can make an impact. So I would like that, that maybe that could be a 2-3 minute kind of digression.
Yeah. See, now, you're right. I mean, see, now, sustainability is a very, very wide topic, and if you talk about anything, we can relate it to sustainability, and everybody is now talking about sustainability as well. But then the question becomes very important, that what is material to you as an organization? If you see, for us, software company, what is material to a software company may not be the material thing for maybe a manufacturing setup, or maybe for some other oil refinery or something, which is totally, the activities are totally different, the issues are different, the risks are different, and the impacts are going to be different, and the magnitude is also going to be different. So in such case, it's very, very important that first you understand yourself on what is material to you in terms of the various activities that you do in terms of your sustainability indicators. What are the relevant indicators for you as an organization, and then how you are going to relate it to, mapping it to your goals, what you want to achieve over the period of time. Maybe every organization may be having a 5-year plan or a 3-year plan at least. So with respect to your plans, how it's going to be impacting your business, and obviously the triple bottom line, as you said, the people, profit, and planet. So that's the way we need to take it, and that will give you an indication where your risks are more. Again, it's a risk-based approach. So where is your risk? So that is the area that anybody will be doing the first step to address that, so that he is not going to be impacted of that particular risk, and then take it forward from there to the next level. It again goes by prioritization of your own risk, and then taking it one by one, or maybe collectively there is a regulatory requirement which need to be definitely complied with. So that's the way it should be.
Excellent. Thank you. I think we are getting some questions from the audience also. And we'll just pull them up. Give me a minute. I think someone has asked a question which is very interesting. Narayan Kavitake, is ISO 14064 certification for organization? Is it is regulatory requirement. Is it a regulatory requirement for organizations to go for ISO 14064 certification?
None of the ISO certifications are regulatory requirements unless it is specified by some country. I don't think any country specifies that ISO 14064 is mandatory, but then it's a voluntary thing that you are going in for the certification. When it comes to, that's what I told, when it comes to this type of reporting, it's actually going global. So your credibility of your reporting, I can report anything about my organization, but then if it is following through a international standard, then that gains credibility, and that too, if it is assured by a third party, then it gains much more credibility on what you're presenting. And I mean, you will have a defined framework which is acceptable to the international community as well.
Well, yeah. So I would like just to add to this that we have to also look at the runway. So if you look at companies and just going a little bit background about financial accounting and financial reporting, so that is like 150 years old now, and the reporting standards are maybe 50 years old, and you have IFRS, which is primarily the standard for all Europe-based companies, Asia-based companies, and then you have the US GAAP, which is followed by the US SEC for all the US listed companies, and most companies report in both formats. They have some subtle differences in how you do, say, depreciation, how you do certain accounting and certain things, but primarily the report will come out the same. So it will not be that a company will report X amount as a profit and a big amount which is very different as profit. It will be small material differences only, but there are some differences in treatment. Similarly with sustainability and with the ESG now, I think we are coming to a state where there are multiple ways in which you can report. There are a lot of assumptions, and I'll just share that, like scope 1, scope 2 is very easy to measure with some degree, that, what is your direct and what is your indirect. Within indirect, what are you purchasing and who are the providers? Are they doing renewable, non-renewable? So you can have those formulas and come very fast. When you come to scope 3, where you're looking at your supply chain and where you're looking at your ecosystem and your employees and the business travel, there's a lot of assumptions and formulas which may not be correct. So that's where the whole ecosystem. So you are as good as your ecosystem. So you are as good as how the standards evolve. And I think we are very, very at the, let's say, at the 10-15% stage right now in the evolution, whereas the financial standards are all 95-100% evolved. So we have to give it a little bit time. I think it will come there. So that I think is the key here. I think one important question, I think one is for me, I'll answer that later, but one important question is also that, there's a question which we also get asked in NASSCOM, that sustainability is key, as we all know, but it also requires investment to start with. It doesn't come cheap, right? If you want to convert or go from a normal power to a renewable energy power, I think you will pay a little bit extra initially, maybe. If you want to switch from a normal leased office to an office which has LED certification in terms of minimizing greenhouse gas emissions, again, you will pay a premium in the construction material used. So there will be always a price you pay upfront or over time when you switch to sustainable options. So someone asked a very clear question that, how does smaller organizations, which could be, part of a larger ecosystem, and on their own, they may not be able to influence much on net zero. How do small organizations get into the journey of sustainability? Would you like to take that, Reghu, or would you like me to chime on this?
Yeah, so it's a challenge, as you rightly pointed out, it's a challenge for small organizations, because ultimately, some of the organizations may be, striving to or struggling to survive. So in such cases, sustainability becomes the second option for them. But then the history goes like this, wherever there is an initiative towards this aspect of sustainability, maybe the initial investments are more, but then that is really paying back in terms of credibility, more business, and also people are now willing to pay more, a premium, for a sustainable product rather than one which they feel that is not sustainable. So that's always there. So it's only the shift that you have to be waiting, and it's already happening. That's what I feel.
So very good. And I would chime in just to say, that like Reghu also said very clearly in his slide presentation, I think all of us feel it, that it's something which your employees are asking about, So I think I am very happy to say that the current set of employees, the millennials, Generation Z, you can call it, They are having a straight, clear opinion about what they like, what they don't like, what kind of companies they want to work for,
Yes.
what the company should stand for. And it's not, they don't want to do greenwashing. Similarly, when you look at the local communities, similarly look at investor community, there is and even the government regulatory framework. So there are, and the clients. I think the biggest question in the IT sector is actually the clients, which are in the US and in the Europe. They are demanding from all the suppliers. It's not only IT suppliers, they're demanding from all the suppliers. Correct. That, are you really adhering to E, S, and G? And the E is very focused on all the parameters in E, including greenhouse gas emissions, water efficiency, waste management, e-waste management, etc. The S goes into DEI, goes into equity of pay, human rights, racial, etc., everything, equality. Then as the governance goes into information security, good governance, board representation, stakeholder management, etc. So I think it's becoming like a movement which is now, that was also in the supply chain. So it's your customers asking you, you are asking your vendors. So everyone is impacted, and we are all connected in this world. So anyone who's doing business is not doing business in isolation. He or she is doing business as an organization or as an individual or as a proprietorship with many entities who are asking the question. So you are forced to do. And for smaller companies, I would say that, don't pick up the big ones. Don't look at Infosys, don't look at a TCS, don't look at a Tata, or don't look at a ITC, or even one of the global companies which Reghu has put in his slide deck. Those can be your aspiration. Your initial should be materiality. What do my people and my clients think is most burning for me? Let me benchmark a little bit and see people in my level, my market capitalization, number of employees, what is material for us. Let's do those 3-4 things and move the needle on those 3-4 things, rather than trying to take 20 things and then finding that all 20 fall because you can't execute.
Yeah, that's what when I was telling, you need to prioritize on which one is
true.
The most impactful for you, and then you take it up.
I think we're running out of time now. Is there any question? Inform, someone has said, thank you, Lord. We answered the question, they're saying thank you, that's good. Inform, handy method of giving awareness to work. I think this is a very key one I wanted to ask Reghu. This is actually I think the last one we should do. What simple measures can organizations and individuals do? Because we all think, the company will do, we cannot do. Let government first give us renewable energy. Then we will think, I want to buy an EV, but there's no charging point. Why should I buy EV? So I will give you my personal example. I have a very eco-friendly wallet made of recyclable material. So there's an awareness, you can in your own way purchase things. You can in your way start looking at, not demanding a package every time you go shopping. When you're giving birthday gifts or return gifts to your children's circle, don't pack them in fancy papers, give them in a newspaper wrap or brown paper. So these are very, very small things in awareness. Or when you switch on your AC, put a timer so that it switches off at night. Don't leave it, it's very hot, I know, in the north at least. So these are all awareness we need to do individually. I think when you have that awareness individually, and I'm very happy to see in my kids that, the schools are teaching them water conservation. When they look at Amazon packaging, they say, nothing against Amazon, I think Flipkart, all the others same. Why are there 5 layers of packaging for something which is not even a glass item or not even, fragile? Why there's one wrap and then another package? And now I think they've got better in it. But earlier they used to really pack everything with 5 levels. So I think it's this at a personal level. But Reghu, maybe you have some ideas. How do we institutionalize the thinking in companies with the people?
Yeah, I think it actually goes by 8 ways. No, the one is you define your company's long-term purpose. That's the first thing that we need to do. Define the long-term purpose and then spell out the economic case for sustainability. Right? And then create knowledge and awareness among your people who are going to be part of your ecosystem to be very, increase their competency on sustainability so that they understand the language that you're talking about. And then make every employee a sustainability champion. That's what I advocate. Unless you become a champion and you feel that you're a champion for sustainability, the level of commitment that you demonstrate towards that may or may not be that good. So make them feel that everyone is a sustainability champion. So that's the way the next step is. Then co-create sustainable practices with employees. Involve them in your strategies. Get their ideas, implement them so that they feel that they are part of the whole journey. Otherwise, if you're deciding that this is a strategy that I'm going to have and this is what I'm going to do, probably they may or may not be fully involved in the whole process. So make them involved, get their ideas, implement some of their ideas. Not everybody, every idea may be, feasible. In that case, at least the feasible ones, you may do that so that they will feel that, okay, now my voice is being heard. So that gives a feeling that, I should be contributing more. So that sort of encouragement will be there, and make sustainability visible inside and outside the company. That's very important. It's not that you advertise it outside and then not there inside, but you make it visible inside and outside the company. So that again gives a feeling that, okay, it's not that we are talking about something, but then we are also actually following and what we are talking about. So that will give much more confidence on the employee side. And then showcase higher purpose by creating transformational change. That's the transformation that we everybody is looking for. We already destroyed much of our resources. We have done enough damage, but now the transformational change is what is required, and that is what even at the school level people are now being taught, and then they are coming with those ideas. When they see the companies also the transformational change that is happening, then they feel delighted and they will be contributing more. That's what I feel. The 8 steps for company to engage more the employees and then make them contribute.
How are we doing on time, guys? Do we have 5 more minutes, or we are more or less done?
So we are, Anuj, through our time. We are already taken 6 more minutes than this slot.
Okay. Okay.
So then I would request that maybe in the chat we'll put in an email, and everybody, whosoever has a question, please drop in your questions, and we'll just answer them and take Reghu on board. Everybody's question answered.
Yes. So no offense to people whose questions we could not take. We just took it as first come, first serve, and there were also some questions which I had in my mind. I think it was a very informative chat. I would thank Reghu again. Some of the resources, Reghu, we could share later, the links, some of the good information, and I'm sure we'll have follow-up sessions also with Reghu and with other experts, because this is a very relevant topic for all of us. And to summarize, the time is now for us to act. The time is not tomorrow. The time is not looking at 2030, 2050 vision. You need to have a vision for this year first and execute that, so in your small way. So that's the key message I would have for everyone. Reghu, anything from your side as the parting words?
That's it. I think the message is very clear that better late than never. So we started at this from today, and as you rightly said, the contribution from everyone is very, very important in this very, very long journey. And thanks a lot for your patient hearing, and I hope you will take this message. Within the short span of time, whatever I could give, I have given. Probably any questions or anything, we can always catch it up through LinkedIn or whatever, and I'll be able to. More than happy to be answering that. Thank you so much.
Can we give a round of claps for Reghu? I think that was a very, 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 very wonderful, informative session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you everybody for joining in today, and I hope it was a wonderful session for everybody. A lot of action items to take home. Thank you so much.
Thank you.